Welcome to the latest episode of Bound to Context. I'm your host, Ryan Shriver, and with me today, all the way from Belfast, I have technologist David Anderson. Welcome to the program, David.
Hi, Ryan. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Cool. Well, David, tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a kind of architect and a technologist. I've been working in software for about 25 years. I started working in telecoms for about 10 years, and then I've been working with Liberty Mutual for this last 14 years. And I've spent a lot of time doing kind of big kind of cloud adoption, cloud architecture, engineering excellence, those type of things. And currently my kind of focus is on just really sort of helping companies kind of move forward in the cloud.
Well, cool. Well, that's where our paths crossed here, but a couple of years back. And I remember thinking that of all the people I'd spoken to, you seemed to sort of get it. You got it between, what I mean by that is between the technology, between the methodology, between how people work. And so, maybe you can tell our audience, like when you solve sort of kind of complex technical problems, but also sort of some teams and organizations, like what's your approach? Like how would you sort of define your approach to problem solving?
Well, I think it's really straightforward. For me, the first thing is just listen and think. I think you got to listen to the problem and kind of see what's happening. And for me, I'm quite kind of visual. I like to kind of sketch something out visual, but really it really starts with the collaboration. I think for me, in companies and software, it all starts with the team. I often think that when we start looking at individuals and what they can do, it's really about what the team can do. So it's always best to have a team-based approach, and I find that is super important. And the longer I've worked in engineering and software, you kind of see it's great teams produce great software and solve problems. That's always the way. And I've quite a few techniques which we can get into about how you actually do that.
Well, yeah. Well, maybe tell us a bit about in your sort of previous role and really in the last part of your career, what types of problems would you help teams sort of solve? I mean, you mentioned sort of cloud adoption, and I know you were involved in the serverless sort of space. Talk to me a bit about some of the problems that you've sort of helped teams solve.
There's a few. There's a specific technique that we've been using this past maybe 5 or 6 years, which led us to serverless and serverless first. And it's called orderly mapping, which is a way of mapping out a strategy. And really the whole premise of orderly mapping is that when you look at the different components in your technical stack, you can look at the evolution of those from genesis, like something's brand new, to custom build, to product, to commodity. And you can start to kind of map out where certain components are. And it's very easy when you do that to actually say, we're spending an awful lot of time on this component here that we've built, but it's actually a commodity. We should just go and rent it from Amazon or something like that. There's no point us building this. And so that kind of lens really kind of helps teams. And for many companies, your line of business isn't really building software. It's creating value differentiated components. So if you can actually split that between the things you should rent and the things you should build, for an insurance company, no one's really going to build your specific customer experience for you, but you can go and get some compute from a vendor. So really it's about, when you sit down with the team and go through that exercise, it becomes very clear where you need to point your efforts to.
It's interesting. I've been digging into the domain-driven design. In fact, Nick Toon was on the program about a week ago.
Wow.
And so we talked about sort of the core, supporting and sort of generic domains and really thinking about those. It sounds like it's very similar. He mentioned orderly mapping too. I haven't yet dug into it, but it sounds like we're at some similar concepts there.
Yeah, Nick Toon's awesome. I'm a big fan of Nick Toon. There's massive crossover between that domain-driven design, orderly mapping, and it's really about, you got to look at technology differently. You can't. There's certain problems you can't code your way out of. You need the kind of organizational approach, and often there's so much detail in the technical stack that people can't actually see it. So by using the techniques which Nick is awesome at, you can actually lay out the different domains and then take a more kind of systemic approach. And it links to good architecture as well. Yeah. And especially when you're going to public cloud, you can't afford to make architectural mistakes because they are extremely costly. On-prem, you can get away with some things, not on public cloud.
It's interesting because a lot of folks that when they do the initial cloud adoption, they kind of recreate their data center, and they're typically the same people who built their data center are the same people who typically build out the cloud. And the thing I've been learning a lot more is, take domain-driven design and apply it to how you think about your cloud environment, as opposed to thinking about physical racks and servers and environments. Use a domain-driven approach. Like, what are your bounded context? I mean, there's a reason this program's named that. Like, it's a bit of a nod to sort of DD. Like, what are your different contexts and domains? And then can we use those to think about how we organize our systems and our teams? And then, to your point, what's core to us versus what's more, supporting and generic we should sort of rent or buy.
Yeah, I've spent an awful lot of time trying to work out domains, and one of the big mistakes you see some companies making is say, I'm the director over this area, this is all my stuff, and then someone else is the director, and then there's a reorg, and the architecture is broken. So it's kind of like, Conway's Law, reverse Conway's Law. So you need to be really careful about not creating your domains with current company structures, because, domains usually stick around for a long time, and the companies always reorg. It's just a natural occurrence.
No, I couldn't say it better. All the examples you typically see is there's like a department-oriented sort of way you're organizing your cloud, and then every company I work with, about every 6 months, there's going to be a good old-fashioned reorg, whether there's one needed or not. Somebody decided to reorg, and then it upsets everything. And you're right. If you tie it more to sort of your business model and your business domain, that something's going to be a bit more long-lasting. Presumably, than sort of your work structure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, and that's really the point back to serverless, because when a lot of people hear the term serverless or serverless first, they think about, it's just the next type of compute. It's Docker, it's Kubernetes, and then it's serverless. And that, that's kind of missing the point. If you sit and do your domain-driven design properly, use something like Wardley mapping to realize what's important, and then if the team have a serverless first mindset, then they can write software really quickly to meet the business KPI. And the business KPI should be associated with the domain. We've got to make this cheaper. We've got to make this faster. We've got to have more sales. Whatever it is, that's what the team focus on. And they don't spend time with what we always call undifferentiated heavy lifting, building things that are of no intrinsic value to that business goal. So that's where the serverless first mindset comes in. We need an eventing framework to fire events to keep the sales. Okay, let's just use one. Don't build an eventing framework. So that is a very important part of that kind of serverless first mindset, is that you're chasing a business goal, and everything else you're kind of trying to offload as quickly as possible.
When you work with engineers, I've noticed in my career, some sort of gravitate towards, once they're introduced to these ideas, some gravitate, and some just don't ever. They just love the tech and the tools. Have you seen either attributes or certain things that, or how have you helped engineers who may have been very tech and tool code focused, like start to see the benefits of sort of this higher level thinking?
There's two really interesting models that I could just touch on, that are they're both complementary. The first one is by Simon Wardley, and there's a few other versions of this model as well, and he calls it pioneers, settlers, and town planners. I don't know if you've heard this before. So the pioneers are the people who love to build new stuff, love the unknown. It's never been done before. I wonder if it's even going to work. It's out there. So pioneers love that kind of, that real challenge. The settlers, once some value has been found, they'll then productize that, make that something that can sell and grow the market. It's that kind of expansion, that scale. And then the town planners will, make it fast, make it reliable, and make it cheap. They can really settle that in. And all three groups are equally as important, but they have slightly different skill sets. And they're all very technical, but a slightly different focus. So there's that mindset. I think Kent Beck also has a version of that in his 3X model: explore, expand, and extract. So there's three different models like that. So first of all, there's that three model, which I think is really interesting: pioneers, settlers, town planners. And then the second model to talk about is team topologies, which is for certain teams. There's four types of teams. There's a stream-aligned team, which are focused on a value stream. There's a complex kind of problem team, which are maybe solving something very specific. There's an enabling team who help other teams. And then there's a platform team, which are kind of building that platform for some of the either value or complex teams. I think once you start to organize your teams in that way, you can assign engineers with that appropriate mindset, either pioneer, settler, or town planner, to the correct team. And I found great success when I'm speaking to teams. You might ask a team, okay, what's your goal? And say, well, we're building a product and we're building a platform and we're helping those other guys. Okay, well, that's three things. You pick one, So I think it's given the team focus of what their main goal is, and trying to coach them not to get distracted by side tasks and secondary goals, and then that the team can get aligned by that. And then if you've got a rock star coder, or somebody who's really good at at coaching the team, or different attributes, they can combine to create that good team. That's why I think that the team element is so important.
No, and that's something I've been picking up recently, is the different types of archetypes of the different types of teams, like you described, and how you think about not only organizing but their focus. I think that's been the last few years I've picked up that, but I see that a lot of my customers these days are in platform building mode, what I call it. Yeah. They're building platforms, right? And then they have to have teams that help others get on the platform, on board and those sort of things. And a lot of times, the same team tries to kind of do both of those things. They try to build it and keep it running and try to get everybody on board, and they're constantly sort of stressed between building out some capabilities and onboarding and helping others. So
and again, the definition of that platform is so important. Again, bringing it back to serverless first. You have a team who might say, or a business who might say, like, okay, we need a bill paying functionality or payments. Let's look at the market. Okay, let's build our own platform. We think that's a good idea. And a huge investment. And eventually you could say, well, if you're a real serverless first mindset, what about just using Stripe? Because I mean, if it's 90%, 98% there, is that extra 2% worth that huge investment of standing up a platform team and supporting it forever? So there's a real kind of return on investment conversation there. So I mean, I think it's great that companies build platforms, but I would be very deliberate about building that platform and be very sure that it is something that's unique and not just maybe slightly better than what you can buy for pay per use.
Yeah, something in that kind of core domain. If it's in the core domain, maybe it's something you consider a platform, but certainly generic. And I don't know about supporting. Yeah, you probably want to rare by. So you mentioned Simon Wardley, you mentioned Kit Beck. Who have been some of your other influences along the way?
That's a great question. There's a few people. There was one writer who wrote a lot of work in the 80s called Jerry Weinberg.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called The Secrets of Consulting, which I remember reading it when I was a younger software engineer, and just been blown away by the common sense and simplicity. That, because a lot of the environment back then, people were deeply technical. It was all about code and really kind of low-level Unix stuff. And for somebody to just come along and say, just talk to the customer and find out what they need. Just listen to them. Ask an open question. And if someone's irate about something being late, don't argue with them. Just say, well, why are they so irate? Did we set did we set expectations incorrectly? So he really dug into the people side of software, which I think is incredibly important, and that's something that's always kind of stuck with me. His approach, and that really, he was one of the big kind of precursors of Agile. So I think Jerry Weinberg has always been a huge influence. I love the work of Marty Kagan. He's from the Silicon Valley Product Group. Yeah. I think product as a term has really taken off this past maybe 5-6 years. But I started looking at Marty Kagan's work many years ago, and I always remember seeing a presentation he did. He talks about Agile and sprints and making sprints in Agile more effective. He talks about sprint 0 and sprint 1 and this kind of and then he says, what about everything before the decision making? When you say, well, let's build a thing, and all that slow decision making, it could take 12 months, and then you're like, boom, you can build it in a week. So I think he is a brilliant kind of very commercial approach to software development. And then finally, Mary Poppendieck, who wrote a lot of the early lean software development stuff. I think Mary is brilliant. It's the way she describes extremely complex areas in a very simplistic way. I think is incredible. So one thing is probably common with the three of those is they're all brilliant communicators, which I think is very important for software.
Yeah, you mentioned Jerry Weinberg. I remember that book, and I think Tom DeMarco was another one that I discovered early on, who sort of really.
Slack.
Yeah, Slack and Waltzing with Bears came later. Slack was good. What was his original one? It's going to kill me. But Anyway, no, I really got a lot from him, and it is funny when you see sort of the agile. You mentioned Mary and lean. She brought that sort of lean background. She had a kind of lean manufacturing background, and she helped bring it to the software world. And then you saw sort of the agile community. I mean, we're what 20 years into agile. I see customers. It's interesting. On some respects, I see a lot of progress. I mean, in terms of the term, the adoption, but I've also in the last number of years seen some opportunities to get back to sort of basic agile and not overcomplicated and not over everything. It's funny, we even get called into engagements like we need to return to the agile principles. Somewhere along the way, the spirit of agility has gotten usurped by ceremonies and tools. Yep. Do you see that in your sort of travels?
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful observation. I've always been a huge fan of the Agile Manifesto, and that even before that was signed, I remember working before that with a lot of the XP and different techniques, and you can see the difference. But I remember going to, I think it was Agile 2008, and I remember thinking, this is kind of weird. There's a lot of stuff that's really not that important, software development, and you see that continuing through. And people obsessing over story points and all this kind of, you're just thinking like people have completely lost focus of what we're actually turning up and work to do, and sometimes some of the frameworks are important, but what everyone what a lot of people miss is the fact there's a continuous growth, continuous learning piece of that. A lot of these frameworks, once you implement it, it's kind of good, but you're supposed to keep changing it, keep moving with it. Even Scrum is kind of, the advice for Scrum is, try it and then start changing it. Yeah. It's prescriptive initially to get the concepts, and then you should start changing it and evolving it. That's where the retrospective comes in. So that little piece has been lost, I think, on many Agile teams. We've got these kind of like the process police. You're not doing your stand-up correctly. You're like, So I think it's problematic. I've started writing small A Agile, which means let's actually have agility in what we're doing and not be big A Agile constrained.
Yeah, it's interesting. I learned XP first from the white book and I spent 3 or 4 years before I even discovered Scrum or knew what Scrum was. And I often wonder, had Kent Beck really wanted to create a methodology and stuck with it, what might be different today via XP? Because today XP is quote unquote the developer sort of things. It's lost the method per se. It's like just what those developers sort of do. Is that what you see as well, or hear as well, I should say?
Yeah, completely. And I mean, I remember I always look at like I said, the Agile conferences, and I started to notice that you have the Agile conference and the Agile technical conference. And that always seemed kind of weird. You go to the Agile technical conference and it's all XP and pairing and TDD and stuff. You go to the Agile conference and it's all about, program management and stuff, which is important, but it's losing sight of things. And there's a lot of tools in the bigger Agile community. This tool will do whatever. So it's kind of, it's definitely problematic. And the one thing I think that has not been solved is actually the portfolio management of these big Agile areas. That's still a problem area. Sorry.
Yeah. No, so what are some of the topics like top of mind these days for you? So you mentioned serverless. I'm assuming that's sort of kind of top of mind. What are the other sort of topics that you're kind of keeping abreast of and focusing on these days?
For serverless is kind of weird. I mean, a lot of people think of serverless compute like Lambda, but you get serverless data, you get managed services. For me, there's a whole idea of serverless architecture. I don't think the term serverless will last. I think it'll fade away. But I think we're at the inflection point of a paradigm shift to a different way of writing software. I think the cloud is going to evolve on to another phase. And today that's serverless, but it's a terrible name. So I'm really interested in kind of exploring that, and it's very connected to how teams work, how the product focus of teams. So there's a whole new way of creating software that many of us say is second nature to some of the kind of the bigger digital companies. like your Amazons or your Googles of this world. But for 99.9% of the companies, it's completely kind of new. So I think it's a really interesting area, and I still think it's evolving. I love the idea of collaborative networks. I think that's really powerful. The fact that even more so with the way social has gone, these different kind of platforms, it's great to see the strength of the crowd bring something on. You see there's a lot of open source work, a lot of different kind of communities. It's incredibly exciting, and you can just dip into kind of networks here and there. And then finally, one thing that I think is starting to become very interesting, like a hot topic, is sustainability with relation to software. How can you write sustainable software? I think you can kind of see this in a lot of the cloud vendors. I mean, if you think of like a sliding scale, I have my own data center. I get in my own tin. I put everything on there. I power that. I do all the work. That's a fairly large carbon footprint there. And then second, I lift and shift over to a public cloud provider and run on their tin, but they'll kind of, they'll run everything for me, so that's not so bad. The third phase, which I think is really interesting, if you start using managed services and different more higher up, more abstract services, then there's a much less carbon footprint. Do you know what I mean? Because you're letting the cloud provider do all that kind of optimization for you. And I think that leads back into good architecture, good kind of reliability, performance, security. So there's lots of really solid architecture principles that you're kind of starting to see. So I do think, connected to the first thing I said there, that new paradigm shift of writing software, I predict in kind of the resurgence of architecture, where it becomes so important that you have to design these. Go back to the domain-driven stuff with Nick June. Yeah. You have to design your systems well, and then make sure they're resilient, because the whole idea of what you might have seen, years ago, you design a system that's perfect, stable, and works. That's not happening anymore, because you're now deploying in a data center and you don't even know where it is. It's somewhere in Western Europe or Eastern USA. It's gone. You've no idea the network, anything else. So you have to design for resiliency. And one of the things that the people are talking about is continuous resiliency. How do we continually make sure that you can handle all these failures? So I think that's a very different way of writing software than even 5-10 years ago. So I think there's and as you can probably tell by the way I'm being quite vague, it's still emerging and evolving.
No, I think in to that last point, I think my eyes were with the chaos community and just what that has sort of brought to thinking about resiliency. And I think what's special about that community is not just the way they're approaching it, but it's also a great small community. It's still sort of feels like an XP sort of small community versus has kind of gone mainstream, if you will. At least here in the US, it's still, it's still a relatively small community.
Well, that's the nice thing about, go back to the earlier points about this idea of collaborative networks. You still have core, like a lot of people who are creating software, they still do it for the love of creating software, and they want to learn off each other, and they enjoy getting into these open source different communities or collaborative networks and developing these new things. So there is a lot of information being shared. It's sometimes when these things are commercialized or productized, when they start to kind of scale, that community moves to the next thing. So I think it's really interesting being in those communities and kind of seeing what people are doing. And you see more and more people doing what Nick June did, and they'll put their stuff in GitHub and say, there you go, there's a whole bunch of stuff, extend it, use it, tell me what you think.
No, I
think
that's
for me what's really exciting. Yeah.
No, I agree. And so you mentioned serverless. When you talk about serverless, it may not be the right term. Do you tend to be you mean like a function or functions of service, or do you mean something different? Is serverless in your definition broader than just sort of a functions of service? Or
I think it's broader. That's why I think it's a bad term, because when most people hear the term serverless, they think of serverless compute, which then equates to function as a service, which is like, Lambda or Google function or Azure functions, where you can say, I'll write a piece of code, I'll put it in a single function, and then when I call that API, it'll execute and then go away, and I'll be charged for maybe, whatever amount of invocations. So a lot of people think of that specific function as serverless, but really when you step back and think about serverless architecture, how would you design your entire architecture in that way? Say you have a database, that the database only runs when it's called. So you only get charged per traffic. You've maybe got an event backbone, which you only get charged for when events are running through it, and maybe based on the amount of events. You could have a process orchestration, where you only get charged via amount of processes that are orchestrated. So it's all traffic driven, not necessarily just if you've no traffic. So one of the sayings of serverless is don't pay for idle. So if you have no traffic on a Sunday, you don't pay any cost on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So it's the same concept of the function, but applied to your entire architecture.
Interesting. And so, at the architecture level, I imagine it doesn't so much matter whether you're deploying AWS or Azure or GCP, right? They have equivalent or near enough sort of servers. Yep. But at some level down, you do have to get there. And, often some of the criticisms I've heard of serverless, well, you're more tied into a specific vendor. It's harder to pick up and port. Like, how do you, part of me is like, I get that, but part of me is like, you're already in there anyway. The likelihood of you just picking up and moving everything to another provider is not something you probably do, that often anyway. Like, how do you respond to that when do you agree that the more serverless you go, that's the more potential for lock-in? And then how do you mitigate that from an architecture perspective if portability is a concern of yours?
Well, Amazon are great saying that they talk about evolutionary architecture. They make sure architecture decisions are two-way doors. It's not a one-way door. So if you decide to do something, you can back out of it at another time. So if you have a really strict kind of if your separation is quite good between microservices and domains, you can say, well, I want to maybe take that out and plug in something else. Not as simple as that, but that don't have a mess of dependencies that constrain you. But vendor lock-in is fascinating. You're always locked into something. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It doesn't matter who it is, if it's an open source thing or a vendor or you're always locked into something, a language. So you need to be really careful what you're locking into. But the first, for me, the first concern is, can we create value for our business? So if you can say, like, okay, we need to get that to market by the end of the year, but I'd like to avoid vendor lock-in, so we're going to miss that deadline. So we're going to be 6 months late. So now we don't have any vendor lock-in. And then your business say, well, okay, we just lost a couple of $1 million to avoid vendor lock-in. Well, how much money is that going to make us? You say, well, something might happen in the future. Yeah. So I think you've got to weigh that up. I always think that the way I respond to that question is the cost of maybe re-architecting that component greater than the cost of making it vendor neutral? Do you know? Could you, if something horrendous happened and the cloud, you had to move off that cloud provider, how long would it take you to refactor or maybe rewrite certain things or move them across? And if you've designed your architecture well, it would be possible. It wouldn't be impossible. Now, it would need to be a fairly significant event to have you to do that. But I don't know. But even one of the things that's also quite an alarming kind of statement that people don't say as much now, but around multi-cloud. If I have my workload running AWS and I'll just automatically shift it over to Google, that's never going to happen. It's like a completely different paradigm. So even if you're running on Docker and you can shift it from Docker here, Docker over there, lots of different concerns. It's not that simple.
Yeah, no, trust me, I hear from some of my customers like, okay, we want to have an AWS and just seamlessly switch it over. And I'm just like to myself laughing. Like, if you think that's your biggest problem, then
it's something. I think it's a good question to ask from a risk mitigation to say, well, if something happens with this cloud provider, could we move to that cloud provider? I think that's an important conversation to have. And what would that look like? From a business risk mitigation perspective. But if you're designing that in as a requirement, I would seriously ask why you're doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you, what are some of those lessons, if you had to depart on our audience, some sort of lessons as they go about trying to maybe adopt some of this more, serverless architecture approach to sort of their problems? What are some of the lessons that you would sort of impart?
So one of the big ones that for many of my teams we talked about constantly was the code is a liability. I think this is the code. The code is not the asset. If you had a team working for a year creating something, that million lines of code is not the asset. The system that they created is the asset. The code is a liability. You want as little code as possible. There are a lot of my engineer peers are currently throwing daggers at me. It's like you're not saying we're not writing code anymore. It's just like think very carefully before you sit and knock out a few thousand lines of code, because there's a cost to maintain that. There's a cost to secure it. There's a cost to run it. So there's a cost with code. So you're better to sit and figure out, well, let's write this piece, because this is a game changer. That other, many thousands of lines of generated, template code, let's try and get around that. So that idea of code as liability, I think, is really important for your architects and engineers to have. The answer to every problem isn't let's write some code. So I think that's really important. I think as well with some of the Wardley map and stuff, and it's a complex technique, but one of the nice parts of it is there's a lot of, it's about identifying points of inertia and points of movement. Where are things going to evolve, and what points of inertia will stop things evolving? So you may write something today and you say, well, in a year's time, we'll just be using something else because that's only a temporary thing. Understand that, and then understand what are the points of inertia that could stop you moving that. I think about, people writing like web frameworks, etc. If you get invested in a web framework that's very popular today, and maybe it moves on, but that's going to be an inertia point because you can't get out of that. So I think you need to identify your points of inertia and what's going to move. I think that's really important. And then finally, I always think when writing software, you need to kind of meet people where they are. You can't come in too opinionated and say, right, we're going serverless and we're going cloud, and that's that. This is what it is. I think it's always important to be. It's almost like a software kind of anthropologist. Go and kind of observe what kind of that's happening, see what the kind of lie of the land is, and see how can we create a system that will work in this business context. And sometimes it's not the latest technology. It's usually a smorgasbord of things that you think will work. But I think you have to come and meet people where they are. I think that's the most important thing. Just that kind of, create a shared understanding with the people you're writing the system with, and write the best thing that will kind of, what's good enough to solve that problem. And don't be too opinionated on using the latest technology just because.
We call it sometimes resume-driven design, right? It's like whenever I'm going to find a way to learn a new tool and find a way to shove it into here, whether it's needed or not. It's funny. I teach design thinking, and empathy is a big part of design thinking. It touches on your last point, and that's something that we've had engineers I've just seen in my career. Some of them just want to look at a story and hold up by themselves and write code. And there's so much more when you can connect them directly with the person who's going to be using the software, and you can have them sit down and observe what it's like for them to go through a day in their life. And what we have learned, and I've learned, is that may be hard for some folks, but there's a lot of joy that comes out when you create software and you can see the person actually using it. If you get it right, their eyes light up and they don't have to deal with this old system and all the workarounds. And there's a lot of value in that one, because otherwise you're just kind of, to your point, you're just working by yourself. You don't even see who uses the system. I think that there's a lot that we in the engineering community can learn about getting closer to our end users and learning more about, observation and empathy and these sort of techniques.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the big things that I was reading something yesterday in social media, and there was a comment about should you give your engineers the business context? And the answer is yes, and yes. Because, if your engineer understands, what the users are doing, what the business problem is, they may see something that you've missed. They say, well, why not? We could do this. So you give the engineer the context, and there's maybe things that they can see that no one else could see, because we can make that faster if we do this. So I think that's, and there's such, you'll get a better solution, you'll get a more cost-effective solution, and plus the engineer will get better job satisfaction, better kind of employee engagement, because you're seeing the impact of your work.
Yeah, and that's related to the movement of defining what are your outcomes, and then getting out of the way and letting the team focus on those, versus getting very prescriptive and these are the stories and these are sort of the tasks.
And bringing it back around, that's properly agile. It's like, don't
Yeah,
worry
it
about
is.
the process. Let's figure out the outcome and let's do it, in a sensible and effective manner. And all these things about tasks, backlogs, points, whatever, they're all mechanisms to help people get to the outcome, which
Yeah.
is kind of what you were implying earlier on. People have kind of lost sight of that a little.
Yeah. Have you heard of Tom Gill? Does that name ring a bell?
Yes, yes.
So Tom came on the program a couple of weeks back. That's how I learned some of this. And Tom was influential, wasn't really part of the Agile movement, but was influenced it. And his whole
Yeah,
point was incremental delivery of value. And he's very,
yeah,
very explicit about this. And then, Tom being Tom said somewhere along the way, incremental delivery of value got replaced with incremental delivery of code. And that's not
yes,
what we ever intended.
yeah,
But what happened with Agile is it got to, and that was CI and CD, and it's positive, but they're at the wrong increment. It's
yeah.
about the value increment, not necessarily the code increment.
Absolutely. And then you see a lot of people like, struggling with, well, how do we define value? And my response to that is, well, if we're unclear what the value is for the software team, let's figure that out.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
if we don't know what we're doing or why it's valuable, then we need to answer that question, because we can't measure success if we're not sure what's valuable.
yeah. And back to your point on code as a liability, I think that's perfect. I think isn't in the Agile community somewhere along the way we lost. Not the ability, but we lost focus on architecture and design. It went from to architecture and design back when I was coming of age, all the UML diagrams and
Yep.
all those sort of things before you even write a line of code. And then it kind of switched too much to, we got a story, let's just start cranking code and we'll sort of architect it as we go. And I think that hopefully what we're coming back to is a little bit of a balance. And I think that, to your point, if you view code as a liability, then you architect now to save time later.
Yeah.
If you think about architecture right, it should be, if I architect it right, I should reduce the amount of code or have the minimum amount of code. And if you view it as a liability, not as something fun to do in an asset, then maybe it does help you sort of reorient. Like, what are you producing?
Yeah.
Are you just cranking more code out or not? So,
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think architecture is really interesting. It's not about the role of the architect. It's not a phase of the life cycle. This is now the architecture phase. It's a property of what you're building, So at any point in time, someone will say, we'll assess the architecture. And these things are actually very well defined, various different well-architected frameworks, etc. So you can actually assess the quality of the architecture, just like in a building. You could have a beautiful building, but it's just about to fall down. So it should be, it's a responsibility of the team who you're building that. And sometimes you'll have external architects who maybe will review that or check it or whatever way. But architecture is part of what the team does, and it's this pushback against big design up front became no design.
yeah, you're right.
Which is not the answer.
Yeah, you're right. So this has been awesome conversation. So I want to wrap it up. Last thing is, what are you listening to these days?
Oh, music-wise,
Or anything?
A couple of things. I tend to do a lot of kind of deep focus work. So I'm listening to some crazy kind of soundscape, people like Max Richter and stuff. So that's kind of interesting. Listening to a lot of old soul and R&B, which is good fun.
Nice.
Always like kind of soul. And then the odd time I'd listen to come out for a walk, Christy Moore. It's a nice kind of Irish, or lots of traditional Irish songs. So if you haven't heard Christy Moore, I would strongly recommend looking her up on Spotify. Some real cracking Irish ballads.
Well, cool. We're going to put it in the notes for this and share it out with everybody. So, David, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's great to see you again and reconnect. And best of luck in your next endeavor. I know you won't stay without for long, so looking forward to staying in touch with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. Pleasure being on. Thank you.
All right. Take care. See you.